Welcome back to my project. The future is uncertain and the end is always near. This is part 2, subtitled Disasters and Economic Ruin in the Empire. The attacks on the empire and the internal civil wars that directly resulted from the contention of emperors and their armies wreaked economic havoc on the provinces and people of the empire. Armies lived off the land as they invaded, and one of the inducements to soldiering was plunder. Victorious armies plundered the riches and enslaved the inhabitants of conquered cities, as illustrated in the case of Shapur I. And destruction and plunder occurred in instances of civil war as well, when rival emperors contended for supremacy. None of this could be good for the local Roman inhabitant, and in fact, populations have been so depleted that Rome could no longer muster the soldiers needed to defend itself. Gibbon has this to say: the feeble elegance of Italy and the internal provinces could no longer support the weight of arms. The hardy frontier of the Rhine and the Danube still produced minds and bodies equal to the labors of the camp, but a perpetual series of wars had gradually diminished their numbers. The infrequency of marriage and the ruin of agriculture affected the principles of population and not only destroyed the strength of the present, but intercepted the hope of the future. He goes on to say, the rapid and perpetual transitions from the cottage to the throne and from the throne to the grave might have amused an indifferent philosopher were it possible for a philosopher to remain indifferent amidst the general calamities of humankind. The election of these precarious emperors, their power and their death were equally destructive to the subjects and adherents. The price of their fatal elevation was instantly discharged by to the troops by an immense donative drawn from the bowels of the exhausted people. However virtuous was their character, however pure their intentions, they found themselves reduced to the hard necessity of supporting their usurpation by frequent acts of rapine and cruelty. When they fell, they involved armies and provinces in their fall. Gibbon mentions the donative here, and this was a particularly egregious item. Donatives were gifts of money to the soldiers by the emperors, usually at the beginning of a reign. It constituted a form of bribery. It had probably served as inducement to the legions and the Praetorian Guard to assassinate one emperor in favor of a contender. And as Professor Friedman points out, this took enormous sums of money that were extracted both as taxes and through debasement of the coin. Debasement tends to accelerate, and so inflation was added to the woes of the populace. And if enemy attacks and civil wars and the concomitant destruction and turmoil were not enough, we can add natural disaster to the list of calamities that beset the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. Gibbon provides a picture. Our habits of thinking so fondly connect the order of the universe with the fate of man that this gloomy period of history has been decorated with inundations, earthquakes, uncommon meteors, preternatural darkness, and a crowd of prodigies, fictitious or exaggerated. But a long and general famine was a certainty, and of a more serious kind. It was the inevitable consequence of rapine and oppression, which extirpated the produce of the present and the hope of the future harvest. Famine is almost always followed by epidemical diseases, the effect of scarcity and unwholesome food. Other causes must, however, have contributed to this furious plague, which from the year 250 to the years 265 raged without interruption in every province, every city, and almost every family of the Roman Empire. During some time, 5,000 persons died daily in Rome, and many towns that had escaped the hands of the barbarians were entirely depopulated. This plague has been labeled the plague of Cyprian. Cyprian was the bishop of Carthage who witnessed and described the plague. Cyprian describes the plague in a sermon. The pain in the eyes, the attack of the fevers, and the ailment of all the limbs are the same among us and among the others, so long as we share the common flesh of this age. Cyprian's biographer, Pontius, wrote, "There broke out a dreadful plague, and excessive destruction of the hateful disease invaded every house in succession of the trembling populace, carrying off day by day with abrupt attack numberless people, every one from his own house. Kyle Harper is a modern Roman history scholar, and the title of one of his books is The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. He wrote in The Atlantic in November 2017, the disease was of exotic origin, and it moved from southeast to northwest. It spread over the course of 2 or 3 years from Alexandria to other major coastal centers. The pandemic struck far and wide, in settlements large and small, deep into the interior of the empire. Historians cannot definitively identify the disease that struck. Harper, based on his research, says a probable identification of the plague of Cyprian is a viral hemorrhagic fever. And he goes on to say that only one family of hemorrhagic viruses seems to provide a best match for both the pathology and epidemiology of the plague of Cyprian. Filoviruses, whose most notorious representative is the Ebola virus. Professor Friedman asked the question as to why problems exploded in the 3rd century. And the Persian activity can be explained by the emergence of the Sassanid dynasty and the ambitions of the new rulers to restore the Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great. The sudden Germanic incursion seemed to have no obvious ready explanation. Gibbon did allude to inundations, earthquakes, uncommon meteors, preternatural darkness, and famine. A 2011 paper in the American Academy of Sciences Science magazine, the title is a mouthful, 2,500 Years of European Climate Variability and Human Susceptibility. This paper looked at the possible impact of climate on migration from the north. It used oak ring chronologies to chart changes in precipitation and temperature and correlated these with historical population movements. And the paper states, exceptional climate variability is reconstructed for approximately 250 CE to 500 CE and coincides with some of the most severe challenges in European political, social, and economic history. For the researchers, this implies that there is a historical association of precipitation and temperature variation with population migrations and settlement desertion in Europe. This is, of course, not conclusive, but it does make it plausible that severe weather and attendant crop failures could have pushed the German migration southward. So the overall picture is one of external invasions from the north and the east, political instability at the top of the government, civil wars, economic dislocation and inflation, famine, a pandemic, and possibly climate disruption during the crisis of the 3rd century. Now I have to ask, do we face a crisis of the 21st century? I will give my assessment in part 3 of The Future is Uncertain. Come back for the final part and the most exciting conclusion to The Future is Uncertain and the end is always near.